Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Hello audience, wherever you may hail, I'm your host John Bruni. Welcome to The Focus, where we bring you the most thought-provoking and informative current affairs analysis from around the world. Each episode we invite top experts and analysts to share their insights on the most pressing issues of our time. From international relations and global economics to philosophy and science, no topic is off limits. Join us as we explore the complex and ever-changing landscape of the world, where we provide valuable perspectives on the events that shape our global community. In this episode, we'll be looking at the UK, especially its foreign affairs. The latest opinion polls show that a Labour landslide is forthcoming in the next general election, expected to be called sometime in the next 12 months. After 13 years in power, the Conservatives are well and truly on the nose. Brexit, which was supposed to give Britain back her independence and turbocharge her economy, has failed to deliver the goods. Economic growth has flatlined, investment and productivity have plummeted, and exports continue to be negatively impacted by the yes vote. The British economy could be as much as 5.5% smaller because of Brexit. According to one leading economic expert, leaving the European Union has knocked out the central pillar that safeguarded the country's economic prosperity. The situation hasn't been helped by nearly a decade and a half of government-imposed neoliberal austerity, which has seen poverty and homeless rates skyrocket. Deep cuts to government spending and a drop in real wages has led to an outbreak of industrial action across the nation. Even one of Britain's most cherished public institutions, the National Health Service, is in trouble as defunding and creeping privatisation takes its toll. As one Conservative critic succinctly noted, life under the Tories has become poorer, nastier, more brutish and shorter. It's little wonder then that winning office may actually be the easy part for Labour. The hard part may be working out the best way forward. Helping us to navigate UK politics is former diplomat and journalist Jonathan Powell. Jonathan served as Chief of Staff to the Blair government from 1997 to 2007. A close and trusted aide to former Prime Minister Tony Blair, Jonathan was there when all the big decisions were made at Number 10. He played a major role in brokering the momentous Good Friday Agreement, which brought peace to Northern Ireland after decades of conflict. Jonathan is now head of Intermediate, a UK charity for negotiation and mediation. Intermediate focuses on attempting to solve some of the most difficult, complex and dangerous conflicts around the world where other organisations are unable to operate. But before we start, a shameless plug for ourselves. Please subscribe to our channel. We need the algorithm to find us, and by hitting the subscribe and like buttons, this is your contribution to the growth of what hopefully will become a South Australian global sensation. Jonathan, welcome to The Focus.
Thank you for having me.
Jonathan, I think we'll start off on a lighter note. Recently, we heard that the Tories now have an unofficial Minister for Common Sense, Esther McVey MP. This presumes that common sense has been missing in the UK's political firmament for some time. What's your view on this?
Well, it's a political gesture. It's rather sad. It's a balancing thing for Rishi Sunak. He's got a problem with the right wing of his party. He sacked Suella Braverman, the right-wing standard bearer, from the job of Home Secretary. He brought in some other more centrist people, and so he had to balance it up. He didn't have any other jobs, so he created a ridiculous one to try and take on political correctness, wokeness and all of that. Because the Tories in the end want to try and have a campaign on social issues of that sort, to try and find dividing lines. What Rishi Sunak is basically doing on everything at the moment is trying to find a dividing line with the Labour Party.
So life in Brexit Britain paints a pretty bleak picture. Where has it all gone so terribly wrong?
Brexit is a good starting point for that. David Cameron, in the coalition government after Gordon Brown lost the election, was following a fairly balanced, sensible policy and in the wake of the world economic crisis, was trying to pull the country back. He introduced austerity, which went down very badly in the country and has caused some of these problems. But the real basic problem, I think, politically happened with him falling into the trap of calling a referendum on Brexit. He didn't need to do that. He was worried about some of his backbenchers to keep them on board. He offered such a referendum. He then tried a negotiation with the EU where he failed to get what he said he was going to get. But really, to be honest, the vote in the Brexit referendum wasn't about Europe at all. It was about a feeling amongst people after the economic crash, after the period of austerity, that they had been forgotten about, that they'd been left, they were being ignored. And I think that their revenge was to vote in protest for Brexit. It's interesting now, if you look at the opinion polls, they show that the public overwhelmingly not only think Brexit was a mistake, but would like to reverse it, which is a real change in the years since that vote. But I think you could probably start our period of dramatic decline from then.
Labour leader Keir Starmer has long been said to suffer from a personality deficit. But considering the parlous state of the UK, this is perhaps not really that important right now. So can you tell us how effective Starmer is as a political operator, and what are we likely to see from him as electioneering starts to heat up?
I think when you have had as many catastrophes politically as we've had over the last few years, we've had quite enough of characters, to be honest. Boris Johnson was a buffoon. He played the buffoon. He was a buffoon. We had Liz Truss with extraordinary self-immolation as Prime Minister for a shorter period than the average lettuce. And before that, we had the psychodrama of Theresa May. So, to be honest, I think people have had enough of character and they'd like a bit of stability. And people forget sometimes that the one key job people expect of a Prime Minister is to be able to run the country, to actually do what's necessary, so they don't have to keep worrying. They elect people every 4 or 5 years, so they don't have to do this stuff. And then if it keeps coming back to them, they get pretty fed up with that. So I think what we'll see with Keir Starmer is a fairly safety-first type of campaign. Tony Blair was more charismatic, was more out there, promoting a vision of a modernised Britain. I think in this case, this is a different sort of election. I think Keir Starmer will be stressing that he will be very reliable, safe with the economy. He's not going to be doing anything dramatic that will disturb things in the way Liz Truss did, but promising changes on public services and the other things that people would really like to see. So I think we'll see a fairly cautious election campaign, one that's trying to build a fairly wide coalition, including the so-called Red Wall in the north of the country, which Labour lost under Corbyn to the Tories, but also to make inroads in some of the more prosperous areas in the south and the east.
Jonathan, many on the left and right of politics have argued that neoliberal economics is not the way to progress forward, stating that the only thing that it's really done is to increase social inequity and inequality. So does Labour have a plan to correct this, or are we only likely to hear about a potential softening of neoliberalism without actually changing this political economic model?
It depends a bit on what one means by neoliberalism, but I think that actually the greater spread of free trade around the world actually has led to a massive escape for people from poverty around the world. Now, what of course it's meant is those in industries that are being overtaken lose out. And what we failed to do as a country and more globally is to help those who do lose out, to get them retrained, to get them educated, to give them a cushion in the period while they have to adjust. And we're going to face a whole lot more of that with AI. As AI comes in, truck drivers, legal secretaries, and so on are going to be really suffering. And if we look back at the Industrial Revolution, the interesting thing about that was what the sort of liberal rulers of Britain in the 19th century did was let it rip. And that was good after 2 generations for the country because we grew massively, but was terrible in those 2 generations for the people who worked on cotton mills or had been craftsmen who lost their jobs and were thrown into abject poverty. There was no cushion. And I think we need to learn that lesson. There will be massive change coming to us in this new AI revolution and automation, and we're not ready for it. And I think sort of, in a way, the question of neoliberalism and looking back at that is yesterday's news. I do worry a bit about the protectionism in a disguised form that's being introduced by, for example, President Biden. When you introduce some of these bits of legislation to try and repatriate manufacturing, you're trying to sort of almost work against the laws of gravity, because in the end, a country like Britain is not going to make its fortune by going back to being an industrial power again. Its strength lies in services. And what we should be doing is trying to strengthen services and make sure those who are losing out by losing their jobs are properly catered for. And we do quite a bad job at both things.
I'm going to raise another topic of controversy. In terms of politics, Britain today is no longer the Britain of the Industrial Revolution, because when the major demographic and population shifts were taking place, it was generally, not exclusively, but generally about people from the countryside moving into the city and getting used to an industrial way of life. Today, we're looking at a native population that is aging very rapidly. We're looking at much larger cohorts of immigrants who are coming in, because obviously if the native population are not breeding up, then of course where are you going to get your young people from? And the cheap and cheerful importation of young people from further afield is what Britain is doing. But you have to say that Britain's experimentation with multiculturalism hasn't been particularly smooth. And we do have elements, right-wing elements within the nativist populations who have, taken up the cause to be anti-immigrant. So do you think that the kind of shifts that we're talking about at the high strategic level will be able to be something that Britain will be able to overcome and successfully move forward with? Or are we likely to see Britain shaken to the core, basically, while it tries to deal with AI, a declining native population, increasing immigration, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really accept that multiculturalism has failed in Britain. You come to London, I mean, it is an extraordinary example of the success of multiculturalism. You can get on my bus and you're going to hear Polish, you're going to hear French, you're going to hear various African languages, and people are perfectly happy getting along together. So in London, it's succeeded. The problem has been that it hasn't succeeded in those parts of the country where it's a newer innovation or where people have lost out as a result of this. So that's where a lot of the tension on immigration comes from. But the fact is that our economy does depend, as you just outlined, on immigration. If we didn't have this massive immigration, our population would be dying off like the rest of the European populations. Look at Scotland in particular, for example. They desperately need immigration. And it isn't actually that we're bringing in young people, we're bringing in families, and they have more children than people who been here for generations. And that's what means that Britain still has a growing population in a way the rest of Europe doesn't. And there's a big benefit to us. We don't want to end up like China with a very old population and a very low base of young people to pay for that old population. Speaking as an old person, I certainly don't want that. So you talk to economists, and if we were to cut immigration, as the government is proposing to do, you would have a very severe impact on our economy and on our social system. Social care, for example, care for old people, depends on being able to bring people in from outside. Now, what happened on Brexit was interesting, because what people objected to was lots of people coming from Poland and elsewhere in Eastern Europe to come and work here. The free movement provisions. They were absolutely essential to our economic growth during that period. The period of boom that we had under Tony Blair and then the beginning of Gordon Brown's time was based a lot on that immigration coming in and taking a lot of low-paid jobs, particularly in industry, which boosted the economy. So to stop that, obviously, had implications for the way that our economy worked. Now, what's happened is, with the stopping of European immigration, is we've had massive immigration from elsewhere, because we still need those people to come. We need nurses in the National Health Service. We need the social care. We need people to work in the leisure industries. So if the government was really going to do what it says it's going to do, having had the massive increase in immigration, having promised to reduce it, the economic consequences and the social consequences would be very severe indeed. And I don't believe they will actually do that. In terms of immigration as a political issue, I mean, it's very interesting for me, I've been quite old, watching how this goes up and down. If the economy is in trouble, immigration goes down as an issue and the economy goes up. People care about the economy much more than immigration. The economy is doing relatively well. Say, for example, you've got full employment, as we have basically at the moment, then immigration as an issue goes up. So I've always thought immigration in this country has never been, as it can become in other countries, I believe sometimes in Australia, such a visceral issue. It is an important issue, but it's not really what drives politics. It's a fringe issue. So, and what's happened to the Tory party is they've got themselves the prisoner of people who champion these fringe issues, people who are still trying to claim that Brexit was a good idea, although they're fairly sotto voce when they do that now. And those trying to oppose immigration use sort of subliminal racism as a sort of strategy in a way. It wasn't very subliminal, of course, but Powell back in the 70s. So immigration is obviously an issue. It's an important issue. It's a difficult one always for the Labour Party because naturally it's a more liberal party from that point of view and wins the vast majority of the immigrant vote in this country. But I don't ever see it as an existential issue in politics in Britain. It's one of the issues, but in comparison to the economy, it's not the issue.
Okay. For a country that hasn't prospered under Brexit, let's now have a look at the UK's foreign policy objectives. The UK is actively involved in supporting Ukraine in its war against Russia. Will this policy plank change in any perceptible way under Starmer?
No, I think that a Labour government will be fully behind Ukraine, resisting the invasion, resisting the aggression against it, and trying to bring that war to an end without Putin managing to triumph. So no, I don't think there'll be any change on Ukraine policy in the UK. I think in general, in the West, there is an issue and support for Ukraine. And we see that obviously, particularly in the United States, which is by far the most important supporter of the Ukraine. So I think the Labour government coming in will be no change to that. But there's a much bigger problem in the West and how we carry on supporting Ukraine as it battles on.
There is a problem with this, and of course you've just mentioned it. The US is the biggest donor of military equipment and support to Ukraine thus far, and if things were to change for the worse next year with the possible re-election of Donald Trump, we might be looking at the United States going AWOL in terms of its overall strategic foreign policy positions. This is going to have an effect on places like London and Canberra and Berlin and Rome. Especially among the continentals, there is this wavering uncertainty as to whether or not they ought to continue or whether they should use back channels to reach back out into the Russian space to see if there's any sort of form of negotiated settlement. How does this complicate London's position? I mean, if you're saying on the one hand, Starmer is going to maintain a firm anti-Russian line on Ukraine and say, for instance, the Transatlantic Alliance, your senior partner in that alliance, says, well, we're out now. Europe can look after itself. How would a Starmer government navigate that?
Well, Donald Trump says he's going to end the war within one day, so none of us are going to have to worry because the war will be over.
Yeah.
So that would solve that problem. But there's a serious point here. In terms of Europe, what I've been struck by, to be honest, is the solidarity and the solidness of the European support for Ukraine. It hasn't actually wavered in the way that the Russians might have hoped. Even yesterday, they voted again to move Ukraine along on the path to EU entry, even despite the threat of a Hungarian veto, which was then removed. So far, the Russian attempts to divide Europe have completely failed. I mean, it's actually a rather striking aspect, even in Italy, in a country where you'd expect with the right-wing government, like the Orban government, to be more mealy-mouthed on Ukraine. They've been very solid in their support. So I don't think the problem comes from Europe, but there is, of course, a problem if Trump wins the presidential elections in the United States. And that's a problem for all European countries. And that's why they need to think about what the consequences would be of a new bout of American isolationism. And it's also particularly for any new government in Britain, a government that comes in next year, is going to have to think about what happens if Trump does win. And I think it reinforces the need for a Labour government to reach out to its European partners. It's not going to be re-entering the EU, but there are an awful lot of things we could do short of that. We could, for example, return to the idea of defence cooperation with the Europeans that was advanced under Tony Blair with the St. Malo agreement and subsequent agreements. We could actually push on that. So we've got some sense of security if we find a US going into isolationism. And I think it's also a series of steps beyond that in terms of scientific cooperation. We're going to have to renegotiate the free trade agreement that the Boris Johnson government totally failed to get Britain's interests protected in what he negotiated with the EU. So I think a sort of much closer relationship with Europe is good in itself and will be absolutely necessary to double bank the risk of a Trump presidency.
A friend of our show and a guest who will be returning to the focus next year, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, former commander of the US Army in Europe, suggests that if the West gave the quantity of support to Ukraine it needed, it would still be possible to push Russia out of the country and return Ukraine to its 1991 borders. How does Starmer and the Labour Party generally view the Ukraine war and the British support it has given thus far?
Well, as I say, the Starmer Labour Party and in government would fully and strongly support Ukraine. They have done in opposition, and I think you would find it very hard to find a cigarette paper as a difference between a Labour approach and the current government's approach. Right. In terms of the provision of weaponry, etc., well, the vast majority has come from the United States and not from Europe. Europe has given more money, but not military assistance, and doesn't have the same type of or quantity of military hardware to provide Ukraine. And that will be one of the problems if the US can no longer do that because of congressional shilly-shallying and in supporting Ukraine. So that is a problem. I slightly question that that's the only problem Ukraine has. They also have a problem of manpower. They simply aren't as big a country as Russia, and they also value life a whole lot more. So they don't risk they don't like to risk their soldiers on the battlefield in the same way the Russians would just pour men in and lose them. So I think there are other problems than just equipment, and I doubt you could win just by equipment, but it's certainly right that the West would be very unwise to pull back on the equipment that it's providing. I mean, we have all sorts of logistical problems of actually producing this stuff. We don't have the capacity very easily to do this. And Russia has changed its whole economy into just a defense industry economy. That's all they do now. Is make shells and equipment, and we don't do that. So that's going to be a difficulty if this war drags on for more years.
Jonathan, you've met with Russian President Vladimir Putin in the course of your work in government. What are your thoughts on him? Do you think he would be satisfied if a ceasefire were adopted guaranteeing him ownership of 19% of Ukraine? Or do you see him now as a perpetual enemy of the West and a thorn in the side of European security?
Well, Putin has said yesterday that his war aims have not changed. That's obviously not true because his war aims initially were to take the whole of Ukraine, and he isn't aiming to do that anymore. So I think Putin actually can sell almost any outcome from the war in Ukraine to his people because he controls the media absolutely. He'll have no difficulty. He'll have no difficulty getting elected in elections next year. So he doesn't really have a political problem. So he has to just decide how long it's worth continuing this war because it is. Although Moscow, the city, and St. Petersburg are not feeling the outcome of this war, the rest of Russia certainly is. And at some stage, that's going to get to be too difficult. So I would be surprised if he doesn't want to find a way of ending the war because he'll want to end it on his terms if he possibly can. And that's what he'll be striving to do. I think that the difficult question is the second one you put. And I wrote about this with David Manning in the Financial Times a while back. You know, after the Second World War, there was the famous long telegram from Moscow that set out the rules of containment, which essentially we followed more or less for the 40 or 50 years after that under successive governments in the United States and elsewhere. And that idea of George Kennan of how you handled Russia in those circumstances, not using military force, successfully not using military force against them, but finding other ways to constrain their global ambitions. And we're going to have to face up to that once this war is over, or if the war carries on. How do we deal with Russia? How do we deal with Putin if he stays in power? Are we going to really sort of dislocate the international system by keeping Russia out? You know, if Putin can't come to any of our countries because he'll be arrested for war crimes, how do we maintain a relationship with Russia in those circumstances? So we do face some very difficult challenges that we're not really facing up to at the moment. We're not really thinking about them because we're so focused on the war, understandably. But there is, in the next year or so, we're going to have to face up to that. If the war ends or if the war goes on, how do we contain Russia? Russia isn't the threat that it was after the Second World War. It's a declining power, not a rising power. But it's a very heavily armed and very aggressive declining power. And sometimes those can be almost more dangerous than rising powers.
Yeah. I'm John Bruni, and you're listening to Sage International's The Focus podcast. And from the UK, we're speaking with CEO of British charity Intermediate and former Chief of Staff to the Blair government, Jonathan Powell. Jonathan, the Israeli war on Hamas has certainly become a political hot potato around the world, with many pro-Palestinian people, Arab and non-Arab alike, making their views felt about Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel, and the Jewish people generally. Prime Minister Sunak has maintained that Britain is squarely behind Israel. With British Labour being more disposed towards the Palestinian cause, are we likely to see a change in the UK's position under a Starmer government? If not, will this alienate many on Labour's left who have been critical of Sunak's unequivocal support for Netanyahu's war on Gaza, many suggesting that the IDF's response to the 7th of October attack was overkill?
I don't see a great division between the parties on this, actually, or at least between the leaders of the two parties. The position that Keir Starmer's taken is fairly similar to the position Rishi Sunak has taken. There's almost bipartisanship on this. But what is different is actually the dynamic nature of what Western governments are doing on this. And Biden's the most obvious example, where he started off with a very strong support for Israel in what it was doing, a sort of hug them close type of strategy. And he's increased his criticism as the damage to civilians in Gaza has spun completely out of control. And so in recent days, you have seen, including today, yesterday, he said some really quite important things, putting pressure on Israel to change its position. He sent out his national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, to Jerusalem to talk to them and to try and persuade them to save civilian lives. So I think what you're going to see, whichever government you have, Britain, Labour or Conservatives, following slightly different from the US, but rather different from, well, actually, and closer perhaps to European governments' lines on this, that they will be saying that, yes, of course, Israel has the right to defend itself from terrorist attacks and to go after those who carried them out, but not at the expense of huge losses of civilian life. And I think that will become more and more clear if the Israelis try and keep this campaign going indefinitely. And that's really the point of tension at the moment, is when should this campaign end? Today, Biden's saying within a couple of weeks, and the Israelis are saying months and months. And that I think you'll find, again, not much difference between a Conservative government and a Labour government.
In 2014, you wrote a book, Talking to Terrorists: How to End Armed Conflicts. Considering your own role in the Good Friday Accords that brought an end to terrorism in Northern Ireland, what would you suggest would be the best way forward to bring an end to the war in Gaza and lasting peace between Israel and the Palestinians?
There's something that happens when you have a horrible terrorist attack. Now, of course, in Northern Ireland, the attacks we had were nothing like the scale of the attack in Israel. The equivalent scale of that sort of attack we never had to face. But even in our country and in France and elsewhere where you have these terrorist attacks, and of course after 9/11, people spin into the 5 stages of grief. They get anger, grief, despair, and finally they tend to come back over time to thinking rationally about how you actually can do this. So first off, what you want is revenge. You want to get back at those who've done things to you, and that's totally understandable. But what we've seen historically is that generally that doesn't work if you want to end the problem. And people start thinking again about how can you actually bring this to a conclusion. And I think one thing that this whole horror has shown is that there isn't a security solution for the problem between Israel and Palestine. 75 years that's been tried. Can you just sort of sit on the Palestinians and keep them quiet? It's not going to work, as it's just been demonstrated. We're going to have to find a political solution. So what the world has to do, as well as getting to a ceasefire, trying to get the hostages out, is to try and think, how do we actually structure a proper negotiation that's not the same as the previous ones that have failed, that is a comprehensive agreement that deals with Jerusalem as well as with the refugees and territory. How can you actually do that? And at the moment, it all sounds like pie in the sky, and people are sort of impossible. But history tells us that it can be possible. In Northern Ireland, we had 3 previous attempts at a peace agreement. In 73, Sunningdale Agreement. In 85, the Anglo-Irish Agreement. In 93, the Downing Street Declaration. They all failed. But the Good Friday Agreement didn't come from nowhere. It was built on those failures. In fact, Seamus Mallon, the SDLP Catholic leader at the time, called it Sunningdale for slow learners, because it had the same elements in it as Sunningdale in 73, but we'd been through 30 more years of killing before we got to the final agreement. Right. So I think the lesson in Israel is also that it may have failed in the past. It may be enormously complicated. It may be the most difficult conflict in the world to try and resolve, but it will be resolved. But it won't be resolved sort of automatically. If we just turn our back on it and hope it goes away, then it won't be. It's going to require leadership with courage, because it will be difficult to do, and with persistence and patience. And if we get that, then I do believe it can be solved.
Speaking of leadership, many of my military colleagues in the UK bemoan the fact that successive governments at number 10 have let the British Armed Forces down by continually underfunding them. In an age where interstate war is making a big and noticeable comeback, what policy measures, if any, do you think Keir Starmer will put forward to address existing challenges regarding the recruitment and retention of military personnel and the acquisition of modern, affordable British-built weapon systems?
Well, it is true that we have run down our armed forces, actually, particularly since we left government when Tony Blair ceased to be Prime Minister. And we now no longer have the power and strength to intervene in the way that we used to be able to do. I don't think there's going to be a sudden new burst of money for the armed forces of a new government because the economy under this government is in such a terrible state, and because the government has built in the Chancellor in the latest budget actually has built in a huge trap for Labour of massive public spending cuts in the next 2 years in a declining economy. So it's going to be very, very hard to put new money into defence or anywhere else, actually, including the healthcare and other systems that have been run down so badly. However, there are things that you can do. We have in this country a procurement system for the military that is absolutely chronically out of control, and it's going to have to be reformed. We also had the most appalling relationships between the Treasury and the MOD. When I used to be in government, every year we started a negotiation on the funding round, and the Treasury and MOD could never agree what numbers they were working on. And the Treasury always felt the MOD had no idea what the real numbers were. So I think we're going to need a new system on procurement. I mean, we tried reinventing it several times, but I think there's a more basic change that needs to happen. And I think we're going to need a better understanding of funding continuity. What I'd like to see is 3-year budgets for defence, a rolling 3-year budget that would give you much better predictability on these things rather than this chop change where we waste huge amounts of money. So I think we have a very sensible shadow Defence Secretary, John Healey, who's really thought about these issues and talked to both the defence industry and military men and women about how to actually sort this out. And so I'm optimistic that although there won't be any new money anytime soon, that we can start at least getting the basis right so that when it is possible to put more money into defence, and as you say, given the state of the world, it'd be pretty unwise to wind down your defence services in these circumstances, that we're in a better basis to do so.
Absolutely. Well, from your experience as a diplomat, do you think that the UK is currently overstretched, that it's doing too much with too little to have a significant effect on global affairs? And by that, I really mean at the moment with this truncated defense budget, priorities are going to be, pushed forward. And one of the priorities at the moment is going to be, what is Britain going to be looking after first? Will it be looking after the high north and the North Atlantic and the the GI-UK gap, which is really a British responsibility and quite a taxing one at that? Or will it, shift resources that it doesn't have into the Indo-Pacific to play a bigger international role in Australia's neck of the woods, for instance, especially under the whole AUKUS regime that we're trying to set up now?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Labour government will be absolutely as committed to AUKUS as the Tory government. That's another thing that will definitely be continuity. But I think a lot of what the Tories have said about the new shift to the Asia Pacific is hype, really. I mean, it's not really been backed up by some. We've always sent 2 gunboats to the Pacific, which are not really going to make an awful lot of difference because we don't have the resources to do that. So our role in the Pacific is going to be a different one. Any government is going to be interested in the area of maximum growth in the world and will want to participate as best it can. And we'll want to help provide security for Australia and our allies in the region. But there are limits on what we're going to be able to do militarily for the reasons that you give. And pretending it isn't the case is just sort of is the sort of danger you get into when you start pretending you have the capacity to do these things and don't. You can put people in a very difficult situation. So I hope there'll be a bit more realism about what we can do in the Indo-Pacific, and I hope that will not mean backing off either AUKUS or our attempt to get involved there and try and help and build up some of these interesting questions that face the world. Is there going to be a NATO alliance of sorts in the Asia Pacific? That's something I hope Britain will play a role, but I don't think it's going to be a hugely significant military role.
With regard to continental Europe, considering the economic difficulties that Brexit has had on the UK, do you think that Starmer will actually push to re-enter the EU?
No, he's been very clear he won't push to re-enter the EU. As I said, it's interesting because opinion polls now show a majority, quite a substantial majority, would like to go back into the EU. But I don't think they really mean that. What they mean is they would like to, in general terms, go back into the EU, but they really don't want to hear about Brexit all over again. We got so sick of Brexit during the 6 years of Tory psychodrama on it that we don't want to hear the word again. So I don't think there's any appetite either in Britain or in Europe, actually, for us to go back in straight away. As I said, I think there's a lot of interest in trying to build up relations with Europe. We've kind of, for ideological reasons, been ignoring Europe, our closest allies, and that's just a terrible mistake. And I think that will be reversed by a Labour government very quickly. But I don't think there'll be any, in the next Parliament, there'll be no move to go back into the EU, in my view.
So if we jump across the Atlantic at the moment, we touched on the likelihood of a Trump victory for next year. But I mean, more generally, can you describe what your views are with regard to transatlantic relations, but particularly between the UK and the US?
Well, I've always been a strong proponent of transatlantic relations all my life, actually. So I'm hoping that we can actually rebuild them a bit, because we have lost out for two reasons. One, sort of structural, because of Brexit, because Britain was of greater interest to the EU while we were in, greater interest to the US while we were in the EU, because we could be influential in the arguments inside the EU on things like regulation, for example. If we're going to talk about AI regulation, if the UK does it by itself, that's going to be irrelevant. If we're in the EU doing it, then it's going to have an impact. So that has undermined us in terms of relations with the United States. And that perennial question of Kissinger's is what the telephone number for Europe. It's no longer the UK, it's Germany or it's France, but it's not us. So that is a structural problem that we've got. Second problem is a political one. That first we had Trump, who was an isolationist. That made it difficult for any government, but particularly for the Tory governments. And then with Biden, where there really is a croix d'oeuvre between Washington and London on many issues, Northern Ireland not least, that have made that relation difficult to make that relationship warm. Now, the interesting thing about the transatlantic relationship is it's underpinned by so many structural elements like the intelligence cooperation, defense cooperation. It carries on regardless of the problems in leadership. But at its best, Thatcher and Reagan, Tony Blair and Bill Clinton, that political leadership adds to the infrastructure underneath. And that has been sadly lacking. So I think a Labour government will certainly try, depending on who's president of the United States, to rebuild that political relationship and try and have a warm leaders relationship to match what happens underneath, and see if we can rebuild our strength and play a role between the US and Europe in the way that we used to. It won't be the same because we won't be in the EU, but we can still play a role on China, for example. What will Britain's position on China be? Will it be the same as the US, the same as the EU, something in between? I think that will be an interesting thing to watch with a new government.
Here in Australia, our national security elite are busying themselves with laying the groundwork for AUKUS, the 2021 agreement inked between Australia, the US and the UK to develop a new trilateral security compact. Most in Australia believe that AUKUS is all about buying nuclear-powered submarines. But of course, the agreement is far more comprehensive, calling for closer cooperation on all sorts of issues, from defence industry, cyber, space and intelligence matters. There have been some disquieting noises coming out of Washington regarding America's own submarine building schedule, suggesting its shipyards may not have enough skilled personnel to add the 3 to 5 Virginia-class boats ordered for the Royal Australian Navy. In the end, though, assuming that we get past phase one of the initial submarine purchase from the Americans, in the long term, Australia, the US and the UK will be building the AUKUS-class submarine, a totally new build. How do you think the UK shipyards will accommodate this new class of boat?
Well, I can safely say that's a question I have no capacity to answer, knowing nothing about shipbuilding or where shipyards stand on these things. But right. I jolly well hope they can pull their finger out and get it done, because it's essential.
Yep, I agree with that. Okay, so foreign policy, of course, Jonathan, is not just about traditional statecraft. These days, it's also about a country being able to meet its international clean energy obligations. In what way has the Sunak government failed to meet the UK's obligations, and how would a Starmer government be any different?
Well, as a country, we've actually done rather well in trying to fulfill our commitments based on what we did in government and what David Cameron in his early years and the coalition government did. So we're actually ahead of where other people are on this. But again, as I mentioned at the beginning, what Sunak is looking for is dividing lines. And in one particular by-election outside London, Boris Johnson's old seat, they managed to hang on to it, the only one they have managed to hang on to, by exploiting a new clean air measure, the ULEZ requirements about cars, old cars with high pollutants. And they won that election, they think, and actually probably did, on that issue, because it was just being introduced the week that the election happened. And they've turned that into the belief that they could be the champion of the car, and that Labour, being so green, is going to lose votes. I have to say that has not been reflected in the opinion polls. They've sort of catastrophically lost the young vote by being anti-green, and they haven't gained any other voters. No one actually really believes that they are going to be for the car, and we're not hearing so much from them on that. But they have pulled back on some of our green measures where we were very much in advance. I think a Labour government will definitely be, I mean, part of our coalition is support of those who care about environmental issues, including in some of the prosperous southeast England seats. So I think you'll see a Labour government set out by Ed Miliband in this. Obviously, there isn't that much money because of what the Tories have done to the economy to spend on those things. But in terms of priorities, the green issues will be right up the front in a new Labour government.
Okay, so finally, what is your bet that the Starmer Labour government can put the cool back into Britannia? And what are your thoughts about how the Tories will find their time in opposition? I mean, do you think that the Tories are going to be out for about a generation? I mean, they've had their time, and their time has been scandal prone, and I can't see from what I notice on the front bench where the new talent is going to arise from. I mean, I might be being very unfair to them, but what are your thoughts?
Well, I'm fairly superstitious, so I wouldn't even count the next election in the bag yet. There's still a year to go. All sorts of things can happen, and you can't be sure that Labour's going to win. But I sincerely hope they're going to win. If Labour wins, it's going to depend a lot on what they do, because people may bring you in because they don't like the last lot, but they forget about that quite quickly. So you have to prove what you can do. So then it will depend on whether a Labour government is able to turn particularly the economy around, which is going to be quite difficult, particularly our chronic problems on productivity and investment. Now, Keir Starmer has committed himself on growth in his 5 missions that he wants to actually bring this about. And I think a lot will depend on whether he can do something on that. If he can, then he has a good chance of being re-elected. Labour governments have not got a good track record of being re-elected. Tony Blair was the only one to get re-elected 3 times. In fact, the only one to have 2 full terms, let alone 3 full terms. So you can't count on a Labour government winning more than 1 term. In terms of the Tories, they look like they're going to go into opposition and pull each other apart. Looks like they're going to have got awful ideological fight. And all that's going on at the moment is people positioning themselves for the leadership positions, trying to outright each other by taking more extreme positions. What we saw in the Tony Blair era was it wasn't an ideological battle in that way, but they had a whole succession of leaders who were completely useless and never had a chance of winning an election. So the Tories will need to sort themselves out, but that can be done in one parliament. Keir Starmer has come in and sorted out the Labour Party remarkably quickly and put it back in a position where it can win. And I doubt the Tories are going to be able to do that very easily if they're stuck deep in an ideological battle. You even have some people in the Tory party talking about a split, because the secret of success of the Tory party has always been that it isn't actually very ideological. It's just a grouping to win elections. So we never have an extreme right party in this country. We have a very wide coalition that goes from centre right to far right. Now, it's possible that tensions become so great they actually split themselves into 2 parties. I kind of doubt that will happen, but they are talking about that. And that will certainly be a subject for debate over the next few years if they go into opposition.
Jonathan, thank you for joining us and for sharing your insights on The Focus.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it very much.
Former Chief of Staff to the Blair government and close and trusted aide to former British Prime Minister Tony Blair, Jonathan Powell. For those of you out there who'd like to grab a copy of Talking to Terrorists, How to End Armed Conflicts, you can find it on your favourite online purveyor of the written word, or for the more old school types out there, check it out at your local bookshop. And to our audience, thanks for tuning into the Focus podcast. We hope that you found today's discussion enlightening and thought-provoking. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to reach out to us on social media. You can find the Focus on Facebook, referenced on the John Bruni and Sage International LinkedIn pages, and on Twitter, or on the Sage International website, sageinternational.com.au, by clicking the Media Center drop-down menu and hitting podcasts. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and or leave us a review on your favorite platform. My thanks to our stalwart production team of Malcolm Hughes and Neil Smart, and to the team at the Ozcast Network. As this is our final episode for the year, from the team at The Focus, a very Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to you all. We hope that you'll join us again in 2024 as we continue to delve into the most pressing current affairs issues of our time. Until then, stay informed and stay engaged. I'm John Bruni, and from Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.
Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to AuscastNetwork.com for details.